The farm where footsteps came but never left. The Hinterkaifeck murders. There are places in this world where darkness settles and refuses to leave, where the walls remember violence, where the silence carries weight, where something terrible happened and the earth itself seems to know. In the Bavarian countryside of Germany, about 70 kilometers north of Munich, there once stood a farmstead called Hinterkaifeck. The name translates simply, behind Kaifeck, referring to the small hamlet nearby. It was an ordinary name for what would become an extraordinary horror. The farm no longer exists. It was demolished in 1923, torn down because no one could bear to live where such things had happened, where 6 people were murdered by someone who then stayed with the bodies, eating their food, tending their animals, sleeping under the same roof as the dead. But before we reach that night in March 1922, before we walk through what the investigators found, we need to understand what came before. Because at Hinterkaifeck, the terror did not begin with murder. It began with footprints in the snow. Andreas Gruber was 63 years old in the winter of 1922. He was not a well-liked man. His neighbors described him as harsh, difficult, someone who kept his family isolated from the community. He lived at Hinterkaifeck with his wife, Cecilia, who was 72, their widowed daughter, Victoria Gabriel, who was 35, and Victoria's 2 children, 7-year-old Cecilia, named after her grandmother, and 2-year-old Josef. The family also employed a maid, though that position seemed difficult to fill. In the autumn of 1921, their previous maid, Crescens Rieger, had quit suddenly. When asked why, she told people the house was haunted. She had heard footsteps in the attic at night, sounds that had no explanation, movements above her head when everyone was accounted for below. The family had dismissed her concerns, but Rieger had been certain enough to leave. Finding a replacement took months. Then, in March 1922, Andreas began noticing things. Small things at first. A newspaper appeared on the property, a Munich publication that no one in the family had purchased. Andreas thought perhaps the postman had made an error, but when he inquired, he learned that no one in the surrounding area subscribed to that particular paper. So where had it come from? Keys went missing. The lock on the machine room door, which had been broken for some time, showed signs that someone had been using the room. Andreas found this unsettling, but did nothing about it. Perhaps he thought it was a vagrant passing through, someone seeking temporary shelter in the cold. Bavaria in early 1922 was a troubled place. The economy was collapsing into hyperinflation. People were desperate. Maybe that was all it was. But then came the footprints. A few days before the end of March, snow fell across the farmstead. When Andreas went out to check the property, he saw tracks emerging from the forest. They led across the fields toward the house, specifically toward that broken lock on the machine room door. He followed them, his breath steaming in the cold air. The prints were clear, deliberately placed, made by someone walking with purpose. They reached the door and stopped. Andreas searched the machine room, the barn, the house. He found nothing, no one hiding, no signs of disturbance. But when he went back outside and examined the snow more carefully, he realized something that made his skin crawl. There were no footprints leading away, only toward the house, never back to the forest. That night, the family heard footsteps in the attic, the same sounds Crescens Rieger had fled from months earlier. Andreas took a lamp and climbed the ladder into the darkness above. The attic was open, accessible from both the house and the barn through a shared space. He searched every corner, found nothing, but the feeling remained that someone had been there, that perhaps someone still was, waiting in the shadows just beyond the lamplight. Andreas told his neighbors about these strange occurrences. They offered to help, to come search the property with him, to assist in securing the farmstead. Andreas refused. He was a proud man, stubborn. someone who did not easily accept help or admit vulnerability. So the neighbors went home, and Andreas and his family stayed alone in the house where footsteps sounded in the night. On the afternoon of March 31st, 1922, a new maid arrived at Hinterkaifeck. Her name was Maria Baumgartner. She was 44 years old, escorted to the farm by her sister, who stayed only briefly before departing. Maria's sister was likely the last person to see any of the 6 inhabitants alive. Maria had been at Hinterkaifeck for only a few hours when the murders began. What happened that evening has been reconstructed by investigators from the evidence left behind, from the positions of the bodies, from the blood patterns and the wounds. The sequence is not certain, no one survived to tell what occurred, but this is what likely unfolded. Sometime after darkness fell, the family members were lured from the house to the barn, one by one. Perhaps they heard sounds from the animals, perhaps they were told there was a problem that needed attention. The barn connected to the house through the stable, a short walk in the cold night air. Andreas went first, then his wife, Cecilia, then their daughter, Victoria, then 7-year-old Cecilia. They were killed with a mattock, a farming tool with a long wooden handle and a heavy metal head, sharp on one edge, blunt on the other. The killer used the blunt side, swinging it with force against their skulls. 4 bodies in the barn, stacked on top of one another, covered with hay as if to hide them, or perhaps simply to make them less visible in the lamplight. Inside the house, in separate rooms, 2-year-old Joseph and Maria Baumgartner were also murdered. Joseph in his small bed, Maria in the maid's quarters off the kitchen. The same weapon, the same brutal efficiency. The post-mortem examination, conducted days later by Dr. Johann Baptist Almüller, revealed the horror in clinical detail. Andreas Gruber's face was destroyed, the cheekbones protruding through shredded flesh. His wife Cecilia had been struck 7 times, her skull cracked, with signs she had also been strangled. Victoria's head showed 9 star-shaped wounds. But the most disturbing finding was about young Cecilia, the 7-year-old child. She had not died immediately. The first blow had incapacitated her, but left her alive. She had lain in that barn for hours, possibly conscious, possibly aware, before death finally came. When her body was found, there were tufts of her own hair clutched in her hands, torn out in what must have been unbearable pain and terror. This detail haunts the case more than any other. This child, suffering in the darkness, surrounded by the bodies of her family, unable to move or call for help, slowly dying while the killer remained on the property. Because whoever committed these murders did not leave Hinterkaifeck that night. They stayed. For 3 days, perhaps 4, the killer lived at the farmstead with 6 corpses. The animals were fed, the cows were milked, smoke was seen rising from the chimney. Neighbors passing by noticed nothing unusual. The killer ate meals in the kitchen, used the fireplace for warmth, moved through the rooms where the dead had lived. What kind of mind could do this? What coldness, what absence of feeling allows someone to function normally in such proximity to their own victims? The bodies were discovered on April 4, 1922. Neighbors had grown concerned when young Cecilia missed school for several days. Victoria had not appeared for choir practice. Mail was piling up uncollected. A man named Lorenz Schlittenbauer, along with 2 other local men, Jakob Siegel and Michael Pohl, went to investigate. They found the barn door unlocked. Inside, beneath the hay, were the 4 bodies. The men searched the house and found Joseph and Maria. By the time investigators from Munich arrived, hours later, the crime scene had been contaminated. Curious townspeople had walked through, touched things, moved evidence. In that era, forensic science was still primitive. There were no fingerprints taken, no photographs of blood spatter, no careful documentation of evidence. The opportunity to solve the case with physical evidence was lost almost immediately. The victims were autopsied, and then, in a decision that seems almost incomprehensible now, their heads were removed and sent to a laboratory in Munich. The skulls were to be examined, measured, studied for clues. Instead, they were lost during World War II. The family was buried without their heads. They remain that way in their graves in Weidhofen, headless victims of an unsolved atrocity. The investigation focused on suspects, and there were many. Over 100 people were questioned in the months and years that followed. Lorenz Schlittenbauer, the neighbor who discovered the bodies, came under suspicion. He had once courted Victoria and claimed to be the father of young Joseph. Witnesses said he had seemed strangely calm when finding the bodies, moving them, unlocking doors with apparent familiarity. He denied involvement and successfully sued several people who publicly accused him. He died in 1941, his name never cleared but never formally charged. Another theory centered on Karl Gabriel, Victoria's husband, who had allegedly been killed during World War I. His body was never recovered from the battlefield. Some speculated he had survived, deserted, and returned years later to exact revenge on a family he felt had betrayed him. But his comrades insisted they had seen him die, and the theory remained speculation without evidence. There were whispers of darker family secrets. 7 years before the murders, Andreas and Victoria were convicted of incest after an anonymous report. Andreas served a year in prison. The conviction added a layer of scandal to the investigation. Some wondered if Joseph was the product of that relationship, if family dysfunction had somehow led to this violence. But these questions led nowhere definitive. In 2007, students from the Fürstenbrück Police Academy re-examined the case using modern criminal investigation techniques. They studied the autopsy reports, the crime scene photographs, the witness statements. They created models, analyzed trajectories, considered psychological profiles. In their final report, they stated that they believed they knew who committed the murders. They had identified a prime suspect, but they refused to release the name, citing respect for the descendants of that person who still lived in the area. So even now, with modern analysis, the answer remains hidden. The farmstead at Hinterkaifeck was demolished in 1923. No one would live there. The land where it stood remains empty to this day, marked only by a small memorial. The site has become a place of pilgrimage for those fascinated by unsolved mysteries, by the persistence of questions that have no answers. What makes Hinterkaifeck so unsettling is not just the brutality of the murders, though that is horrific enough. It is the accumulation of wrongness, the footprints that came but never left, the sounds in the attic, the killer who stayed with the bodies, the contaminated crime scene, the lost evidence, the child who died slowly, in terror and pain, the bodies buried without their heads, the case that came so close to being solved in 2007, only to have the answer withheld. It is the feeling that someone knew, that someone still knows, that the truth exists somewhere, held by someone, kept secret for reasons we can only guess at. And it is the knowledge that this happened in an ordinary place, to ordinary people, for reasons we may never fully understand. The darkness that settled at Hinterkaifeck in March 1922 has never lifted. More than a century has passed, and the questions remain. Who walked from that forest with such purpose? Who climbed into the attic and waited? Who killed 6 people with a farming tool and then stayed to tend the animals and eat their food? We do not know. Perhaps we never will. But the story endures because it reminds us that evil is real, that some acts are so incomprehensible they resist explanation, and that sometimes the silence keeps its secrets forever. If this exploration of one of Germany's most haunting unsolved crimes has stayed with you, I hope you will take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. There are more stories waiting in the darkness, more mysteries that deserve to be remembered, and I will be here to guide you through them with the care and respect they require. Until next time, may you find answers to the questions that keep you awake at night, and may your footprints always lead safely home.